All right, well, we've been looking at some of the broader themes within the classical aesthetic theories of Western thought, Plato, Aristotle, Hellenistic thinkers, Plotinus, and even a little about the religious themes within medieval Western thought and the rise of humanism in Western thought. And the reason that I wanted us to look at these is so that we can begin to see what some of the basic contours of the conversation around aesthetics and art have been. These shape the way we think about this now, and knowing a little about this and how this works, well, it'll help us along through the rest of the course. But if I had to point to a place where I think that impact, where that bend in the conversation is most important, I would say that it is in the philosophy of the late 18th and into the 19th centuries. This German idealism and then also Romanticism of the 19th century. And nowhere is that more pronounced than in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Um, Kant is the cornerstone, not just I think of a lot of aesthetic theory, but of really of modern philosophy generally. He really changes the tone. He changes what's talked about, the way that we talk about ideas, and from that, the way in which we talk about art and aesthetics as well. What's more, Kant's also interesting because in addition to having sort of this big, broad, systematic philosophical view, uh, his aesthetic theories are intimately wrapped up with that overall philosophical project. So that part of the way in which you understand what the project is by understanding the aesthetic theory. And unfortunately, you certainly aren't going to understand the aesthetic theory unless you have a basic sense of how his overall philosophical projects are working, at least what they're aiming towards, what their mission statement is, so to speak. So what I want to do is I want to say a little bit about Kant's overall philosophical projects and give, if you like, a setting to where this aesthetic theory that he's going to be developing is, and then begin to talk a little about that, how it works, what it deals with, and what some of its consequences are. All right. Well, if I were to say what's Kant's philosophy all about, I would probably put it this way. Using Kant's language, I would say that Kant is trying to establish a transcendental critique of the nature and possibilities of mental life in general. Transcendental critique. Well, those are 50-cent words. What's that supposed to mean anyway, Seth? Let me tell you. Transcendental is a term you may have come across before. It's certainly been in the reading, and you hear it from time to time, even in colloquial speech, although rather highfalutin colloquial speech. But it's a term that Kant uses, and he thought was pretty important for his overall project. Transcendental here means that which accounts for the condition for the possibility of something being the case. The condition for the possibility. So what needs to be present in order for something really basic, like in this case, mental life, intellectual life, what needs to be present in order for that to happen? What are the structures of, say, consciousness? What are the rules of logic? What is the relationship of logic to empirical observation, knowing through the senses, or in relation to language, or in relation to faith, or of course in relation to aesthetics. All these kind of questions, these are questions about the transcendental nature of mental life. So, transcendental, the condition for the possibility of whatever it is that you're investigating. And remember too, when he talks, when I say the condition, what has to be there, he's really talking more about a principle, right? The condition that he's speaking of is a principle. Okay, one down, one to go. We got transcendental, what about critique? Well, when Kant talks about critiques, basically what he means is an analytical investigation into the scope and the limits of some area in question. Okay, so an analytical investigation of the scope and limits of some area in question. Again, with the big words, kind of tough. Well, let me tell you what I mean by that. You certainly know what scope means, right? Just how broad something's going to go, and limits, well, that's what's implied by the scope. So what it is that's covered, what's not covered, what formally can be said to be part of mental life, and what is there that we can say is real but isn't necessarily part of mental life or is somehow separate or divorced from mental life. Um, Objectivity, for instance, those kinds of things. And then, as far as analytical goes, when I talk about analytical, or when Kant talks about analytical, what he's talking about are what is the, I don't know, the basic architectural components intellectually. What are the basic pieces that fit together in making an idea work the way it is? So Kant's endeavor, and it's a big endeavor, is to look at mental life, to look at what the underlying principles, the transcendental principles, are, and then give a critique as to the scope and the limits of what that is. What can be thought? What are the principles that allow for the possibility of thinking? How does thinking work? And how does this thing called thinking play out in our ordinary ways of dealing with not just reasoning, but with our action, with our will, with our desires, with our feelings, with our aspirations, right? These are the things that Kant is working on. Now, there's one more thing you got to keep in mind about Kant and his way of doing business, and it's this. Kant is a deeply methodological philosopher, to the point where there are a number of ideas where he gets into their workings in such a technical and methodological way that it can be really, really hard to follow him. And you kind of wonder why he's even bothering to do it this way, because it makes it sound so abstract and so obscure that you can't really relate to it. This makes sense, I suppose, with some of the stuff he does in the earliest of his, what are called his critiques, namely the critique of pure reason, where he tries to talk about the very possibility of understanding and what can and cannot be considered within the whole of human understanding. This makes, I suppose, even some sense in his second work, what he calls the critique of practical reason, which really is what can we say about our ethical life? What is the nature of our obligations? How ought we to constrain our desires? Indeed, what ought we to aspire towards? But it's something that seems to get a little, I don't know, should we say, out of hand, and that Kant actually gets criticized himself later on, after he's dead, unfortunately, but for when he talks about his third area, the critique of judgment. Because this methodology is what he's bringing to play when he talks about these four quote-unquote moments of taste, these four moments of the realization of the aesthetic and our aesthetic judgment when we encounter a work of art, a thing of beauty, a moment of the sublime. So let me talk about those in a moment, what these four moments are, what they mean, how they work, and what it is that they can help us come to understand.